music is an enigma. In Much Ado About Nothing, a Shakespearean play, Benedict asks, "Is it not strange that sheep's guts should hale souls out of men's bodies?" In all cultures, certain rhythmic sounds give listeners intense pleasure and heartfelt emotions. What benefit could there be to diverting time and energy to the making of plinking noises, or to feeling sad when no one has died? Many suggestions have been made. Music bonds the social group, coordinates action, enhances ritual, releases tension. It's a tension relief, just like laughter. As far as biological cause and effect are concerned, music is useless. It shows no signs of design for attaining a goal such as long life, grandchildren, or accurate perception and prediction of the world. Compared with language, vision, and social reasoning, physical know how, music could vanish from our species and the rest of our lifestyle would be virtually unchanged. Music appears to be a pure pleasure technology, a cocktail for recreational use, perhaps a recreational drug in order to place the superstitious beliefs and lies of religion predicated on fear and prejudice. And perhaps that we ingest this music through the ear to stimulate a mass of pleasure circuits at once. Music is the universal language, one might say, but that is misleading. Anyone who lived through the craze for Indian music after George Harrison made it hip in the 1960s appreciates that musical styles vary from culture to culture and that people most enjoy the idiom they grew up with. Of course, I've played in many wind ensembles, marching band, jazz bands, all kinds of bands, playing three right now. I love music. I've been playing music since I was in elementary school, piano, brass. And during the concert for Bangladesh, George Harrison was mortified when the audience applauded for tuning up his sitar. Musical sophistication also varies across people, cultures, and historical periods in ways that language does not. The neurologically normal children spontaneously speak and understand complex language, and the complexity of spoken vernaculars carries little across cultures and periods. In contrast, however, while everyone enjoys listening to music, many people cannot carry a tune. Fewer can play an instrument, for that matter, and those who actually can play need explicit training and extensive practice. Perfect practice, after all, makes perfect performance. Musical idioms vary greatly in complexity across time, cultures, and subcultures, and music communicates nothing but formless emotion. Even a plot as simple as boy meets girl, boy loses girl, cannot be narrated by sequence of tones in any musical idiom. All this suggests that music, whether lyrically or technologically from an instrumental standpoint, is quite different from language in that it is a technology, not an adaptation. But there are some parallels, however, as we shall see. Music may borrow some of the mental software for language. And just as the world's languages conform to an abstract universal grammar, the world's musical idioms conform to an abstract universal musical grammar. That idea was first thought of by the composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein in The Unanswered Question, a passionate attempt to apply Noam Chomsky's ideas to music. The richest theory of universal musical grammar has been worked out by Ray Jackendoff in collaboration with the music theorist Fred Lerdahl, and incorporating the ideas of many musicologists, before them most prominently Heinrich Schnicker. According to the theory, music is built from an inventory of notes and a set of rules. The rules assemble notes into a sequence and organize them into three hierarchical structures, all superimposed on the same string of notes. To understand a musical piece means to assemble these mental structures as we listen to it. The building blocks of a musical idiom are its inventory of notes, roughly the different sounds that a musical instrument is designed to emit. The notes are played and heard as discrete events with beginnings and ends and a target pitch or coloring. Like I have said, music is really just the manipulation of sound and pitch and time duration. That sets music apart from most other streams of sound, which slide continuously up or down, such as a howling wind, an engine roar, or the intonation of speech. The notes differ in how stable they feel to a listener. Some give a feeling of finality or settledness, and are suitable endings of a composition. Others feel unstable, and when they are played, the listener feels a tension that is resolved when the piece returns to a more stable note. And in some musical idioms, the notes are drum beats with uh, different timbre, coloring, or quality, and in others, the notes are pitches that are arrayed from high to low but not placed at precise intervals. But in many idioms, the notes are tones of a fixed pitch. We label ours do, re, mi, or C, D, E. The musical significance of a pitch cannot be defined in absolute terms, but only by an interval between it and a reference pitch, usually the stablest one in the set. Of course, the human sense of pitch is determined by the frequency of vibration of the sound. And in most forms of tonal music, the notes in the inventory are related to the frequencies of vibration in a straightforward way. One need only to look at music theory a little bit deeper when trying to understand music. But when an object is set into a sustained vibration, a string is plucked, a hollow object is struck, a column of air reverberates. The object vibrates at several frequencies at once. The lowest and often loudest frequency, the fundamental, generally determines the pitch we hear, but the object also vibrates at twice the fundamental frequency, but typically not as intensely, at 3 times the frequency, even less intensely, at 4 times less intensely still, and so on. These vibrations are called harmonics, or overtones. They are not perceived as pitches distinct from the fundamental, but when they are all heard together, they give a note its richness. But now imagine disassembling a complex tone and playing each of its overtones separately and at the same volume. Say the fundamental frequency is 64 vibrations a second, the second C below middle C on the piano. The first overtone is a vibration at 128 cycles a second, twice the frequency of the fundamental. Played by itself, it sounds higher than the fundamental, but with the same pitch. On the piano, it corresponds to the next C going up the keyboard, the C below middle C, and there are 8 octaves within on a piano, but nevertheless, the interval between the 2 notes is called an octave. And all people, indeed all mammals, perceive tones separated by an octave as having the same quality of pitch. The second overtone vibrates at 3 times the fundamental frequency, 192 times per second, and corresponds to G below middle C. The interval between the pitches is called the perfect fifth. And of course, there's the circle of fifths as well. The third overtone, 4 times the fundamental, which is 256 vibrations per second, is 2 octaves above it, middle C. The fourth overtone, 5 times the fundamental, 320 vibrations a second, is the E above middle C, separated from it by an interval called the major third. These 3 pitches are the heart of the pitch inventory in Western music and many other idioms. The lowest and most stable note, C, in our example, is called the tonic, and most melodies tend to return to it and end on it, giving the listener a sense of repose. The perfect fifth, or G note, is called the dominant, and melodies tend to move toward it and pause there at intermediate points in the melody. Just think about Bach's fugue in G minor. The major third, or E note, in many but not all cases, gives a feeling of brightness, pleasantness, or joy. For example, the opening of Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock begins with the tonic, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock rock. Proceeds to the major third, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock rock. It goes to the dominant, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock rock, and remains there for several beats before launching into the main verses, each of which ends on the tonic. More complicated pitch inventories are filled out by adding notes to the tonic and the dominant, often corresponding in pitch to the higher and higher and softer and softer overtones of a complex vibration. The 7th overtone of our reference note, 448 vibrations a second, is close to middle A, but for complicated reasons, not exactly. The 9th, 576 vibrations a second, is the D in the octave above middle C. Put the 5 pitches together in the same octave, and you get the 5-tone or pentatonic scale, and a common in musical systems across the entire world. At least, this is a popular explanation of where musical scales come from. Not everyone agrees, however, in music theory. Add the pitches of the next 2 distinct overtones, F and B, and you get the 7-tone or diatonic scale that forms the core of all Western music, from Mozart to folk songs to punk rock to most jazz. With additional overtones, you get the chromatic scale, all of the white and black keys on the piano, the individual notes and their half steps in between, given the esoteric art music of the 20th century, incomprehensible to the uninitiated, tends to stick to the notes of the chromatic scale rather than using arbitrary collections of frequencies. Added to the feeling that most notes want to return to the tonic C are other tensions among the notes. For example, in many musical contexts, B wants to go up to C, F wants to be pulled toward E, and A wants to go to G. Pitch inventories may also contain notes that add an emotional coloring. The C major scale, if the E is lowered in pitch by half a tone to E flat, forming an interval with respect to C, called the minor third, then in comparison with its major counterpart, it tends to evoke a feeling of sadness, pain, or pathos. The minor seventh is another blue note, which evokes a gentle melancholy or mournfulness. Other intervals give off feelings that have been described as stoic, yearning, needful, dignified, dissonant, triumphant, horrific, flawed, and determined. The feelings are evoked both when the notes are played in succession as part of a melody, and when they are played simultaneously as part of a chord or harmony. The emotional connotations of musical intervals are not exactly universal, because people need to be familiar with an idiom to experience them, but they are not arbitrary either. Infants as young as 4 months old prefer music with consonant intervals, such as a major third, to music with dissonant intervals, such as a minor second. And to learn the more complex emotional colorings of music, people do not have to be conditioned, Pavlov style, say, by hearing intervals paired with joyful or melancholy lyrics, or by hearing them while in a joyful or melancholy mood. A person merely has to listen to melodies in a particular idiom over time, absorbing the patterns and contrasts among the intervals, and the emotional connotations developed automatically. Those are the pitches, how they are strung into melodies, however. Jackendorf and Lerdahl show how melodies are formed by sequences of pitches that are organized in 3 different ways, all at the same time. Each pattern of organization is captured at a mental representation. Take the opening of Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land." This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to New York Island. Alright, I can't sing, that's why I play musical instruments, but anyways, you get the point. The first representation is called a grouping structure. The listener feels that groups of notes hang together in motifs, which in turn are grouped into phrases, which are grouped into lines or sections, which are grouped into stanzas, movements, and overall pieces that are constructed by composers. This hierarchical tree is similar to the phrase structure of a sentence, and when the music has lyrics, the two partly line up. The grouping structure is shown by brackets beneath the music. Of course, the snatches of melody for "This Land Is Your Land" and "For This Land Is My Land" are the smallest sized chunks. When they are joined together, they form a larger chunk. That larger chunk is joined with the combined chunk from California to the New York Island, into still larger chunk, and so on and so forth. The second representation is a metrical structure, the repeating sequence of strong and weak beats that we count off as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a 4/4 overall structure, time signature. The overall pattern is summed up in musical notation as the time signature, which I've just mentioned, as 4/4, 4 beats per measure, and the major boundaries of the structure itself are demarcated by the vertical lines separating the music into bars. Each bar contains 4 beats allocated among the different notes, with the first beat getting the strongest emphasis, the third beat an intermediate emphasis, and the second and fourth beats remaining weak. The metrical structure in this example is illustrated by the columns of dots under the notes. Of course, most people don't have that when you're reading or sight reading music. Each column corresponds to 1 tick of a metronome. The more dots in a column, the stronger the accent on the note. The metronome is really the how many beats per minute that you're playing. It indicates how fast you're playing the piece of music. The third representation is a reductional structure. It dissects the melody into essential parts and ornaments. The ornaments are stripped off and the essential parts further dissected into even more essential parts and ornaments on them. The reduction continues until the melody is reduced to a bare skeleton of a few prominent notes. Here is this land boiled down first to half tones, then to 4 whole tones, and then to only 2 whole tones. And we call them whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, and you get the picture. The whole passage is basically a fancy way of getting from C to B. We hear the reductional structure of a melody in the chords of the rhythm. We also hear it when the band that accompanies a tap dancer plays one of the stanzas in stop time, striking a single note in place of an entire line of music so that the tapping is easier to hear. And we sense it when we recognized variations of a piece in classical music or that of jazz. The skeleton of the melody is conserved while the ornaments differ from variation to variation. Jackendorf and Lerdahl proposed that there are in fact 2 ways that melodies may be dissected into simpler and simpler skeletons. I have shown you the first way, the time span reduction, which lines up with the grouping and metrical structures and designates some of the groups and beats as ornaments on others. Jackendorf and Lerdahl call the second one a prolongation reduction. It captures the sense of musical flow across phases, the build-up and release of tension within longer and longer passages over the course of the musical piece, culminating in a feeling of maximum repose at the end. Tension builds up as the melody departs from the more stable notes to the less stable notes, and is discharged when the melody returns to the stable ones. The contours of tension and release are often also defined by changes from dissonant to consonant chords, from non-accented to accented notes, from higher to lower notes, and from prolonged to non-prolonged notes. The musicologist Derek Cook worked out a theory of the emotional semantics of the prolongation reduction. He showed how music conveys tension and resolution by transitions across unstable and stable intervals, and conveys joy and sorrow by transitions across major and minor intervals. Simple motifs of only 4 or 5 notes, he said, convey feelings like innocent, blessed joy, demonic horror, continuous pleasurable longing, and a burst of anguish. Longer stretches and passages with motifs within motifs can convey intricate patterns of feeling. One passage expresses the feeling of a passionate outburst of painful emotion, which does not protest further, but falls back into acceptance, a flow and ebb of grief. Being neither complete protest nor complete acceptance, it has an effect of restless sorrow. Cook supports his analysis with lists of examples that have a consensus interpretation, many with lyrics that offer additional corroboration. Some musicologists scoff at the theories like Cook's, finding counterexamples to every claim. But the exceptions tend to come from fine classical music, which uses interwoven and embedded and ambiguous lines that challenge simple expectations and engage a sophisticated listener. Cook's particular analyses may be debatable, but his main idea that there are lawful connections between patterns of intervals and patterns of emotion is clearly on the right track. So, that is the basic design of music, but if music confers no survival advantage, where does it come from and why does it work? I suspect that music is auditory cheesecake, an exquisite confection crafted to tickle or to excite the sensitive spots of at least 6 of our mental faculties. A standard piece tickles them all at once, but we can see the ingredients in various kinds of not quite music that leave one or more of them out. The first is language. We can put words to music, and we do when we see a lazy lyricist aligns an accented syllable with an unaccented note, or vice versa. That suggests that music borrows some of its mental machinery from language, in particular from prosody, the contours of sound that span many syllables. The metrical structure of strong and weak beats, the intonation contour of rising and falling pitch, and the hierarchical grouping of phrases within phrases all work in similar ways in language and in music as well. The parallel may account for the gut feeling that a musical piece conveys a complex message, that it makes assertions by introducing topics and commenting on them, and that it emphasizes some portions and whispers others as asides. Music has been called heightened speech, and it can literally grade into speech. Some singers clip or slip into talking on pitch instead of carrying the melody, like Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, and Rex Harrison. They sound halfway between animated between animated music and tone-deaf singers. Rap music, ringing oratory from preachers, and poetry are also other intermediate forms. Secondly, you have auditory scene analysis. Just as the eye receives a jumbled mosaic of patches and must segregate surfaces from their backdrops, the ear receives a jumbled cacophony of frequencies and must segregate the streams of sound that come from different sources. The soloist is in an orchestra, a voice in a noisy room, an animal call in a chirpy forest, a howling wind among rustling leaves, etc. Auditory perception is inverse acoustics. The input is a sound waves, the output a specification of the sound makers in the world that gave rise to it. The psychologist Albert Bregman has worked out the principles of auditory scene analysis and has shown how the brain strings together the notes of a melody as if it were a stream of sound coming from a single sound maker. One of the brain's tricks as it identifies the sound makers in the world is to pay attention to harmonic relations. The inner ear dissects a blare into its component frequencies, and the brain glues some of the components back together and perceives them as a complex tone. Components that stand in harmonic relations, a component at one frequency, another component at twice that frequency, yet another component at 3 times the frequency, and so on, are grouped together and perceived as a single tone rather than as separate notes. Presumably, the brain glues them together to make our perception of sound reflect reality. Simultaneous sounds and harmonic relations, the brain guesses, are probably the overtones of a single sound coming from one sound maker in the world. That is a good guess because many resonators, such as plucked strings, struck hollow bodies, and calling animals, emit sounds composed of many harmonic overtones. What does this have to do with melody? Tonal melodies are sometimes said to be serialized overtones. Building a melody is like slicing a complex harmonic sound into its overtones and laying them end to end in a particular order. Perhaps melodies are pleasing to the ear for the same reason that symmetrical, regular, parallel, repetitive doodles are pleasing to the eye. They exaggerate the experience of being in an environment that contains strong, clear, analyzable signals from interesting, potent objects. A visual environment that cannot be seen clearly, or that is composed of homogeneous sludge, looks like a featureless sea of brown or gray. An auditory environment that cannot be heard clearly, or that is composed of homogeneous noise, sounds like a featureless stream of radio static. When we hear harmonically related tones, our auditory system is satisfied that it has successfully carved the auditory world into parts that belong to important objects in the world, namely, resonating sound makers like people, animals, and other instruments. Continuing this line of thought, we might observe that the more stable notes in a scale correspond to the lower and typically louder overtones emanating from a single sound maker and can confidently be grouped with the sound maker's fundamental frequency, the reference note. The less stable notes correspond to the higher and typically weaker overtones, and though they may have come from the same sound maker or instrument as the reference note, the assignment is less secure. Similarly, notes separated by a major interval are sure to have come from a single resonator. But notes separated by a minor interval might be very high overtones, and hence weak and uncertain ones, or they might come from a sound maker or an instrument with a complicated shape and material that does not give out a nice clear tone, or they might not come from a single sound maker or instrument at all. Perhaps the ambiguity of the source of a minor interval gives the auditory system a sense of unsettledness that is translated as sadness elsewhere in the brain. Wind chimes, church bells, train whistles, horns, and sirens can evoke an emotional response with just 2 harmonically related tones. Recall that a few jumps among tones are the heart of a melody. All the rest is layer upon layer of ornamentation. The third is emotional calls. Darwin noticed that the calls of many birds and primates are composed of discrete notes in harmonic relations. He speculated that they evolved because they were easy to reproduce time after time. Had he lived a century later, of course, he would have said that digital representations are more repeatable than analog ones, but nevertheless he suggested, not too plausibly, that human music grew out of our ancestors' mating calls. But his suggestion may make sense if it is broadened to include all emotional calls. Whimpering, whining, crying, weeping, moaning, growling, cooing, Laughing, yelping, baying, cheering, and other ejaculations have acoustic signatures. Perhaps melodies evoke strong emotions because their skeletons resemble digitalized templates of our species' emotional cause. When people try to describe passages of music in words, they use these emotional cause as metaphors. Soul musicians mix their singing with growls, cries, moans, and whimpers. Singers of torch songs and country and western music use catches, cracks, hesitations, and other emotional tics. Ersatz emotion is a common goal of art and recreation. I will discuss reasons in a following section. The fourth is habit selection. We pay attention to features of the visual world that signal safe, unsafe, or changing habitats, such as distant views, greenery, gathering clouds, and sunsets. Perhaps we also pay attention to features of the auditory world that signal safe, unsafe, or changing habitats. Thunder, wind, rushing water, bird song, growls, footsteps, heartbeats, and snapping twigs all have emotional effects, presumably because they are thrown off by attention-worthy events in the world. Perhaps some of these stripped-down figures and rhythms at the heart of a melody are simplified templates of evocative environmental sounds. In the device called tone painting, composers intentionally tried to evoke environmental sounds like thunder or birdsong in a melody. Perhaps a pure example of the emotional tug of music may be found in cinematic soundtracks. Many movies and television shows literally have orchestrations behind them, the viewer's emotions from the beginning to the end with quasi-musical arrangements. They have no real rhythm, melody, or grouping, but yet they can yank the moviegoer from feeling to feeling. The climatic rising scales of silent films, the lugubrious strings in the mushy scenes of old black and white movies, the source of the sarcastic violin gesture that means you are trying to manipulate my sympathy, the ominous two-note motif from Jaws, the suspenseful cymbal and drum beats in the Mission Impossible television series, the furious cacophony during fights and chase scenes. It is not clear whether this pseudo-music distills the contours of environmental sound, speech, emotional cries, or some combination, but it is undeniably effective. Fifth is motor control. Rhythm is the universal component of music, and in many idioms it is the primary or only component. People dance, nod, shake, swing, stride, clap, snap to the music, and that is a strong hint that music taps into the system of motor control. Repetitive actions, walking, running, chopping, scraping, digging have an optimal rhythm, usually an optimal pattern of rhythms within rhythms, which is determined by the impedances of the body and of the tools of surfaces it is working with. A good example is pushing a child on a swing. A constant rhythmic pattern is an optimal way of time and how to time these motions, and we get moderate pleasure from being able to stick to it, which athletes call getting in a groove or feeling the flow of time. Music and dance may be a concentrated dose of that stimulus to pleasure. Muscle control also embraces sequences of attention and release. For example, in leaping or striking, actions carried out with urgency, enthusiasm, or lassitude, and erect or slumping body postures that reflect confidence, submission, or depression. Several psychologically oriented music theorists, including Jack Andoff, Manfred Kleins, and David Epstein, believe that music recreates the motivational and emotional components of movement. 6 is something else. Something that explains how the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Something that explains why watching a slide go in and out of focus or dragging a filing cabinet up a flight of stairs does not hail souls out of men's bodies. Perhaps a resonance in the brain between neurons firing in synchrony with a sound wave and a natural oscillation in the emotional circuits. An unused counterpart in the right hemisphere of the speech areas in the left, some kind of spandrel or crawl space or short circuit or coupling that came along as an accident of the way that auditory, emotional, language, and motor circuits are packed together in the brain. But this analysis of music is speculative. It is nicely, considering it complements the discussions of the mental faculties and the rest. I choose them as topics because they show the clearest signs of being adaptations. I chose music because it shows the clearest signs of not being one.